They say monsters don't live under your bed. They live in castles. And in the early 1600s, there was one castle in the hills of Hungary where whispers of blood and screams in the night turned into one of the darkest legends in history. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the story of Elizabeth Báthory, the woman accused of bathing in the blood of virgins to preserve her beauty. But was she truly the most prolific female serial killer in history, or the victim of a political conspiracy? Stick around, because what you're about to hear is far stranger and far scarier than any horror movie. Elizabeth Báthory's name still lingers in the shadows of European folklore. Born in 1560 into one of the most powerful noble families of Hungary, she was surrounded by wealth, privilege, and political power. She grew up in a world where alliances were sealed with marriages, where armies clashed for control of the region, and where peasants had no voice. From the outside, Elizabeth's life looked like something out of a royal fantasy. But behind the castle walls, her story was far more twisted. Elizabeth was the niece of the King of Poland and the cousin of the Prince of Transylvania. From a young age, she was taught to read and write in multiple languages: Latin, German, Hungarian, and Greek. This was highly unusual for women of her time, and it gave her a sharp mind that few men could match. But she was also exposed to things most children never saw. Chronic illnesses in her family, possibly due to inbreeding, made her familiar with seizures, fits, and sudden outbursts of rage. Some historians say she may have even witnessed brutal punishments carried out on the family estates, shaping her view of life, power, and cruelty. At just 15, Elizabeth was married to Ferenc Nadasdy, a wealthy and powerful Hungarian count who would become known as the Black Knight of Hungary. He spent most of his life at war with the Ottomans, leaving Elizabeth in charge of the vast family estates, dozens of castles, and thousands of peasants. Imagine that, a teenage girl running lands larger than some small kingdoms. With her husband away on the battlefield, Elizabeth had complete authority. To the peasants, she wasn't just a noblewoman. She was the law. It was during this time, according to legend, that whispers of cruelty began. Some say she was quick-tempered, that she lashed out when servants disobeyed, that she punished them harshly. But these were noble households where physical discipline wasn't just common, it was expected. What made Elizabeth different, though, was the scale and the rumors that followed her. Servant girls disappearing, mysterious burials near the castle, strange noises in the night. Then came the turning point. Ferenc Nadasdy died in 1604, leaving Elizabeth a widow at 44. Now, without her husband's shadow, she had even more power. And this was when the legends grew darker. Testimonies later claimed that young girls from nearby villages were lured to the castle with promises of work, and never seen again. Some said Elizabeth tortured them with needles, scissors, and branding irons. Others claimed she bit their flesh. The most shocking accusation was that she bathed in their blood, believing it would keep her young forever. Whether this was fact or myth, it cemented her place in history as the so-called Blood Countess. But here's where the story takes a turn. In 1610, King Matthias of Hungary finally ordered an investigation into Elizabeth. The reason wasn't just morality, it was money. Elizabeth owed the king a massive debt, and if she were convicted of crimes, her lands and fortune would be seized by the crown. Was this a genuine pursuit of justice, or a political move to take down a powerful woman and grab her wealth? The investigation was unlike anything seen before. Dozens of witnesses, from peasants to priests, were called to testify. Some claimed they saw piles of bodies. Others swore Elizabeth beat girls to death with her own hands. A few even said they saw her bathing in blood. But here's the catch. Not a single accusation came directly from someone who wasn't under pressure. The witnesses were often servants who may have been tortured themselves to confess. The evidence was shaky, but the stories were horrifying. By 1611, Elizabeth Báthory was accused of killing anywhere from 80 to over 600 girls. That number, 600, comes from a single servant's testimony, claiming she kept a list of victims in a secret diary. No such diary was ever found, but the legend stuck. The climax of her story came when soldiers stormed her castle at Sejd. What they claimed to have found shocked even hardened warriors. Some accounts say they discovered girls chained up, others mutilated, some already dead. Elizabeth herself was arrested, but here's the strange part. Unlike most accused criminals of her time, she was never put on trial. She was too powerful, too noble, and executing her outright would have caused chaos. Instead, she was sentenced to life imprisonment, sealed inside her castle chambers. The windows were bricked up, with only small slits left to pass her food. For 4 years, she lived like a ghost in her own fortress until she was found dead in 1614. Now, for centuries later, historians are divided. Was Elizabeth Báthory truly the most prolific female serial killer in history, or was she framed by political enemies eager to take her land? The truth lies somewhere in the fog of history. What we do know is that her story has fueled countless legends, from vampire myths to horror movies. And behind the legend was a woman whose life was more complex, more tragic, and more terrifying than the stories we tell today. By the time the investigation into Elizabeth Báthory began in 1610, she was already one of the most powerful women in Hungary. That was a problem. In a world ruled by kings, princes, and generals, a widow with vast wealth and her own private army was dangerous. Add to that the fact that Elizabeth's family ties reached into Poland, Transylvania, and Austria, and you had someone who could easily upset the balance of power. To her enemies, she wasn't just a woman. She was a threat. King Matthias of Hungary had been waiting for his chance. Elizabeth's late husband, Ferenc Nadasdy, had lent him money to fund his wars, and by the time Ferenc died, Matthias owed the Bathory family a fortune. What better way to erase a debt than to brand the widow a murderer and seize her estates? So when rumors began spreading that young servant girls were vanishing at Szeged Castle, the king pounced. He appointed 2 men to lead the investigation, György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, and a trusted ally of the crown, and a team of priests and nobles who had every reason to paint Elizabeth in the darkest light possible. Their mission was simple: build a case strong enough to bring down a countess. The testimonies they collected sound like something out of a nightmare. Servants described torture chambers where Elizabeth allegedly drove needles under fingernails, poured freezing water over naked bodies, and left girls to die in the snow. Some swore she beat them with iron rods until their bones snapped. Others claimed she sewed their lips together or smeared them with honey and left them to be eaten alive by insects. The more shocking the tale, the more it seemed to stick. And then came the most infamous detail of all: blood. One servant said Elizabeth once struck a maid so hard that blood splattered on her hand. She noticed her skin looked smoother afterward, and from that moment, she supposedly became obsessed. According to the legend, she began draining the blood of virgins and bathing in it, believing it would keep her young forever. Now let's pause here. Bathing in blood is the detail that cemented Elizabeth's place in history as the Blood Countess. But historians today are skeptical. The story doesn't appear in the earliest records of her crimes. It was added years later, most likely by storytellers who wanted to turn her into a Gothic monster. Did Elizabeth actually bathe in blood? Probably not. Did she mistreat her servants and commit violent acts? That's much harder to deny. Still, the investigation was messy from the start. Over 300 witnesses were called. Some swore they saw bodies hidden in the castle grounds. Others claimed they saw Elizabeth herself beating young girls until they collapsed. But not a single person ever said they saw her kill with their own eyes. And here's the crucial detail: almost all of these witnesses were commoners or servants. In a society where nobles had absolute power over peasants, those testimonies were shaky at best. People could be bribed, threatened, or tortured into saying anything. Despite that, Thurzo and his men decided they had enough evidence. In December 1610, they stormed Szeged Castle. What they claimed to have found was grisly. Several girls were discovered, some dead, some wounded, some locked away. Elizabeth was arrested on the spot. According to legend, she was caught in the act of torture. But again, the records are fuzzy. One report says she was having dinner. Another says she was in bed. The truth? We'll never know. What we do know is that 3 of her closest servants, Dorothea, Ilona, and Janos were dragged off and interrogated. Their confessions were brutal and most likely forced under torture. They admitted to helping Elizabeth beat and kill dozens of girls. Some claimed the number was around 80. Others said closer to 300. Then came the infamous claim that Elizabeth kept a ledger listing over 650 victims. But that ledger has never been found. In 1611, the case went to trial. But here's the strange twist. Elizabeth herself never appeared. She was never allowed to speak in her own defense. Instead, her servants were tried, tortured, and executed. Dorothea and Ilona had their fingers torn off with hot pincers before being burned alive. Janos was beheaded, and his body thrown into the flames. Their confessions sealed Elizabeth's fate without her ever being formally convicted. Why wasn't she put on trial? Because she was a noblewoman, and nobles in Hungary couldn't be executed without creating political chaos. If the king executed her, her powerful family would have revolted. So they reached a compromise. Elizabeth would be kept alive, but she would never walk free again. She was confined to a set of rooms in her castle, the windows and doors bricked up, with only small holes left for food and water. For the next 4 years, Elizabeth lived like a prisoner in her own fortress. Some accounts say she paced endlessly, muttering to herself. Others say she wrote desperate letters, begging for justice. But no one came. In August 1614, guards found her lying face down on the floor. She was 54 years old. Officially, she died of natural causes. Unofficially, some whispered she had been poisoned or simply starved to death. With her death, the legend of the Blood Countess only grew. The image of a beautiful noblewoman bathing in blood spread across Europe. In some ways, Elizabeth became a template for vampire myths, especially when combined with the legend of Vlad the Impaler. Even Bram Stoker's Dracula has shades of Elizabeth in his eternal thirst for young blood. But was she truly guilty of mass murder? Or was she the victim of a smear campaign? Historians are divided. On one hand, the testimonies of torture and death are too numerous to ignore. On the other, the sheer number, 600 victims, seems impossible. To put that in perspective, if she had killed one girl every week, it would have taken her over 12 years to reach that number. And remember, she was under constant scrutiny from neighbors, priests, and nobles. Could she really have hidden hundreds of murders? Some modern scholars argue that Elizabeth was framed. She was a wealthy widow with no husband to protect her, sitting on a fortune that the king desperately wanted. By accusing her of monstrous crimes, the crown could seize her lands, erase its debts, and destroy her political power in one stroke. In fact, after her arrest, large portions of her estate were divided among rival nobles. Convenient, isn't it? There's also the matter of gender. In the 17th century, powerful women were often portrayed as unnatural or dangerous. A widow who refused to remarry, who commanded servants and soldiers, and who managed estates on her own was bound to attract suspicion. Calling her a witch, a monster, or a murderer was a way of putting her back in her place. Still, it's hard to dismiss the testimonies completely. Even if Elizabeth wasn't bathing in blood, it's possible she did abuse and even kill some of her servants. Life for peasants was already brutal. Starvation, disease, and violence were common. A countess taking out her anger on powerless girls might not have seemed shocking at the time. What made it shocking was the scale and the myth that grew around it. So who was Elizabeth Báthory really? The evidence leaves us with 3 possibilities. She was either a sadistic killer who tortured dozens, maybe hundreds of young women, or she was an innocent noblewoman destroyed by political enemies, or she was something in between, a cruel woman who abused her servants, but whose crimes were exaggerated into legend. What we can say for sure is that Elizabeth Báthory remains one of history's most chilling figures. Her story is a mirror, one that reflects both the horrors people are capable of and the power of rumor and fear to destroy a reputation forever. When Elizabeth Báthory died in 1614, you'd think the nightmare would end. But death didn't close the book on her. It only opened a darker chapter. Because once she was gone, people were free to tell her story however they wanted. And over the years, that story grew bigger, bloodier, and far more terrifying than even the trial records had described. At first, her body was buried at the church in Sejd, the same village where her castle loomed over the hills. But the villagers were furious. They didn't want her buried in holy ground. To them, she wasn't just a criminal. She was cursed. She had brought death and fear into their homes, and now they believed her presence would poison their land. So her body was dug up and quietly moved. Where exactly she was finally laid to rest is still a mystery. Some say her remains were taken to the Bathory family crypt. Others say she was hidden in an unmarked grave. Either way, her final resting place vanished from history, almost as if people wanted her memory erased. But you can't erase a story that shocking. Word of Elizabeth's crimes spread quickly across Europe. By the 18th century, she had become a folktale, a cautionary monster whispered about in taverns and written about in pamphlets. She wasn't just a cruel noblewoman anymore. She was the Blood Countess, a woman who bathed in the blood of virgins to keep herself young. Never mind that no evidence of the bloodbaths appeared in the earliest records. It was the kind of detail that stuck. And once a story like that attaches itself to you, it's impossible to shake off. It's easy to see why the legend grew. The early 1600s were a time of obsession with witches, demons, and the supernatural. Across Europe, women were being accused of witchcraft, tried, and burned at the stake. A powerful widow who supposedly tortured young girls fit perfectly into that narrative. Elizabeth's story became tangled with the era's fears about women, power, and dark magic. She was turned into a symbol, the noblewoman who crossed the line between human cruelty and the supernatural. Over the centuries, the legend only grew more Gothic. Writers and historians repeated the blood-bathing story without questioning it, and each retelling made it more dramatic. By the 19th century, when Gothic horror was all the rage, Elizabeth Báthory was almost a celebrity monster. She was mentioned in connection with vampires, alongside Vlad the Impaler, the man whose cruelty inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula. While Dracula was imagined as a man thirsting for blood, Elizabeth was remembered as a woman bathing in it. Together, they became the king and queen of European horror. But here's something interesting. Unlike Dracula, who was purely fictional, Elizabeth was real. People could point to her castle, to the documents of her trial, to the names of her supposed victims. That gave her story a chilling edge. She wasn't just a legend. She had lived, breathed, and ruled in Hungary. And that blurred line between fact and myth made her irresistible to storytellers. In the 20th century, her reputation exploded in popular culture. Horror films portrayed her as a vampiric beauty, forever young thanks to the blood of virgins. Novels turned her into a Gothic anti-heroine, a female Dracula. Even heavy metal bands wrote songs about her. Elizabeth Báthory became less of a historical figure and more of an icon of horror. For many people, she wasn't even a real person anymore. She was a monster, a legend, a face on the same shelf as vampires and witches. But while the legend grew, historians kept digging. And what they found was a story that wasn't nearly as simple as woman bathes in blood. For one, the political motive behind her arrest was undeniable. The king's massive debt to the Bathory family vanished when Elizabeth was imprisoned. Her vast estates were divided up among her rivals. To her enemies, she was a goldmine, but only if she could be destroyed. And what better way to destroy a woman's reputation than to accuse her of the most unthinkable crimes? Think about it. In the early 1600s, what scared people the most? Witches, demons, and blood. Tie Elizabeth's name to those, and you've guaranteed her downfall. Whether she killed dozens or none at all, her enemies didn't need proof. They only needed a story strong enough to stick. Modern historians are torn. Some argue that Elizabeth really did kill maybe dozens of girls, but nowhere near the hundreds claimed. After all, records show that bodies of dead servants were discovered at her castle. And she certainly had a reputation for cruelty. Others believe the entire case was built on lies, inflated by peasants' rumors and the crown's greed. One Hungarian scholar, Laszlo Nagy, even compared her case to a witch trial built more on fear and politics than on fact. And then there's the uncomfortable truth about class. Peasant girls in 17th century Hungary were expendable in the eyes of the nobility. If a maid disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances, who would have cared? Elizabeth may have been cruel, but cruelty toward servants was common among nobles. What made her different was how her enemies chose to weaponize those stories, turning her into a larger-than-life monster. Still, some evidence refuses to go away. Dozens of testimonies describe violent punishments, torture, and killings. Even if some were exaggerated or coerced, the sheer volume suggests that something terrible happened at Sedged Castle. Was Elizabeth a sadistic abuser who let her power go unchecked? Or was she a scapegoat for men who wanted her fortune? The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. What we do know is this: Elizabeth Báthory's story has outlived every attempt to bury it. For 100 years later, she's still remembered as the Blood Countess. Her castle still stands in Slovakia, now in ruins, drawing tourists and ghost hunters. People still whisper about the screams said to echo through its walls, about the spirits of young girls wandering its halls. Even in death, Elizabeth refuses to rest quietly. And maybe that's the most haunting part of her story. Legends fade. Monsters are forgotten. But Elizabeth's name still has power. She may not have bathed in blood, but her reputation has been soaked in it for centuries. Whether she was a serial killer, a victim of conspiracy, or both, her legacy is a reminder of how thin the line between history and horror really is. So, was Elizabeth Báthory really the serial killer queen? Let's step back and look at the picture one last time. On one side, we have the legend. A countess who lured hundreds of young girls to her castle, tortured them in unspeakable ways, and bathed in their blood to preserve her youth. On the other side, we have the history. A powerful noblewoman with political enemies, accused of crimes that just happened to wipe away the king's enormous debt and redistribute her land to rival nobles. Somewhere between those two extremes lies the truth. Let's imagine the reality. Elizabeth was born into power, raised in a world where peasants were nothing more than property. She grew up seeing cruelty, violence, and superstition as everyday facts of life. She married a ruthless warrior, managed vast estates, and wielded authority that most men in her time would never tolerate in a woman. It's not hard to picture her being strict, even brutal, toward the girls who served in her castle. A slap, a beating, or worse, punishments that, while horrifying to us, were disturbingly common in her world. But then came the whispers. Maybe one girl vanished, and the village gossiped. Maybe a maid turned up dead from neglect or abuse. Soon, rumors snowballed into tales of torture chambers and blood rituals. And when the king needed a reason to crush her, those rumors became weapons. Testimonies were collected, confessions forced, and before long, Elizabeth wasn't just a widow with too much power. She was a monster. And here's where the story takes on a life of its own. Because once you add blood to the mix, you're no longer talking about crime. You're talking about legend. The idea of a woman bathing in the blood of virgins taps into something primal. Our fear of vanity, of women wielding power, of aging, and of death itself. It's the kind of image that sticks in the mind forever, no matter how shaky the evidence. That's why Elizabeth's name didn't die in her castle. It lived on in folklore, twisted into the archetype of the eternal beauty who feeds on youth. Centuries later, when vampire stories were sweeping Europe, she fit right in. Vlad the Impaler gave us the thirst for blood, and Elizabeth gave us the obsession with youth. Put them together and you have the building blocks of Dracula. But if you strip away the myth, what do we really see? A woman who, at best, was a cruel and abusive noble. At worst, a serial killer who targeted those least able to defend themselves. But we also see a political game where a powerful widow became an easy scapegoat. In the end, Elizabeth Báthory's story isn't just about blood and horror. It's about how history treats women who step outside the roles expected of them. Was she punished for murder or for being too powerful? What's certain is that her reputation was destroyed forever. Even if Elizabeth had been innocent, the accusations were so outrageous that her name would never recover. And perhaps that's the cruelest punishment of all. For over 400 years, she has been remembered not as a noblewoman, not as a mother, not even as a widow, but as the Blood Countess. And maybe that's why her story still haunts us, because it forces us to ask questions that don't have easy answers. What happens when rumor becomes truth? When politics disguises itself as justice? When cruelty is amplified into myth? Elizabeth Bathory's life sits right at that crossroads, between history and horror, reality and legend. And that's why she remains one of the most chilling figures of all time. Today, if you visit the ruins of Sejd Castle in Slovakia, you'll see crumbling walls and moss-covered stones. But if you listen closely, locals will tell you the stories. Some say you can still hear the screams of girls echoing through the halls. Others claim to see a shadowy figure, a woman in a long gown, pacing endlessly behind the bricked-up walls where she died. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, standing in that castle is enough to send shivers down your spine. Because you're not just walking through ruins. You're standing in the middle of a story that has refused to die for centuries. So, was Elizabeth Báthory the world's deadliest female serial killer? Or was she the victim of one of history's greatest smear campaigns? The truth is, we'll never know. What we do know is this. She was powerful, feared, and accused of crimes so terrible that her name became immortal. And maybe that's the real horror, not just what she may have done, but how her story reminds us that history is written not by the innocent or the guilty, but by the survivors. One thing is certain, Elizabeth Báthory will never be forgotten. Her legend still stalks the dark corners of our imagination, reminding us that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who actually lived. So if you ever hear the name of the Blood Countess, remember this. The truth might be lost in time, but the terror she inspires is eternal. And if you thought this story was chilling, wait until you hear about the forgotten noble family whose obsession with holy relics turned them into grave robbers of saints. Click the next video on your screen, you don't want to miss it.